Thanks, Wendy. I think if you ever get to chat to the lad that lives in Cape York, you'll understand our methodologies that we back in terms of teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are very, very, very different indeed, and our approach to school attendance is also very, very different indeed. But firstly, can I acknowledge the Larrakia people, and it's very great to be back on your country, and I'm certainly going to leave it how I found it. Pristine, beautiful as ever, and I pay my respects to the diversity of our First Nations people that are in the room today. You certainly are the champions, and when I see your young people perform like this morning, and to see them when I was at a bachelor, to see the youth group that I went in to have a look at that's part of this conference, you are really in good hands. You have a great, strong future. I'm really privileged to be a part of, to be a teacher and be a part of the teaching profession. We are privileged to be a part of this profession because we have the opportunity to influence the hearts and minds of future Australian leaders. We certainly have the opportunity to strengthen our cultural identity within the school sector and the cultural identity of our young people that might feel very lost in a Western education system that doesn't actually treat them in the way that they should be treated. And this is why the work of MATSITI, which I'll talk about in much more detail soon, is really important. This was a real privilege as a teacher to be asked to lead a 4-year program to increase the numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers and leaders in the Australian school system. It was great to meet outstanding Aboriginal teachers who were in their first year, were 5 years out, were 30 years out, to meet Aboriginal principals that still had the fire in the belly and commitment to come to their work every day with culture at the centre, front and centre of their minds in the work that they did, despite the many challenges that Western white communities provided them when they wanted to champion Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges and worldviews in their everyday school curriculum. It was great to meet again, we don't see them there's not too many of them, but fantastic, innovative, creative and passionate bureaucrats, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. I haven't seen that for a while, but with this project, they were certainly very much committed to it and made the work of leading this project easier than what it could have been. And I hope those same bureaucrats are going to take the project forward into the future. As I said, teaching is a privilege where you get to an opportunity to shape the hearts and the minds of young people. So the task was quite simple, really, but the job is immense. You know, we have around 10,000 schools in Australia. We have around 400,000 plus teachers. We have a population of over 3.7 million students in Australian schools, but we only have around about 200,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. And as we know, the majority of those are in the the government sector, and the second higher population are in the Catholic sector, and that becomes important when I talk about the city, because we invested heavily in the Catholic sector because we wanted to ensure that those schools also had the opportunity to attract and retain Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers and leaders, but more importantly, was a place where Indigenous kids saw it as a pathway for them if they and their parents so choose to go. When we started this project, I suppose increasing the numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers in schools, we had around 2,100 or something. We now have 3,100. So we have increased it over the time that this project saw its 4-year period out. So we've met really the aims of this particular project. I was really pleased that when we were doing this work, that we had my colleagues, Dr. Kay Price, an outstanding educator and very much a really wizard and expert in the area of curriculum design, and certainly from the world view of being an Aboriginal woman and how she approached her work over nearly 30 years. My colleague and mentor, Emeritus Professor Paul Hughes, is also another colleague that many people might have known over his work. He started the first initial piece of work for the Commonwealth Schools Commission with Professor Eric Wilmot when they had, in the NAEC, set a target of 1,000 teachers by 1990. So we're building on this particular work. And as I said, well, I think we all understand that we stand on the shoulders of giants, people that were real trailblazers that set the pathway forward for us. And so we found this task a bit easier than they probably would have way back around 1989. In terms of the policy context that we've that we worked through that drove this work and this investment, people would recall that when Kevin Rudd came into the Prime Minister's ship and Gillard was his education minister, they talked about an education revolution. Now, whatever you might think about Kevin or Gillard, the fact is that they achieved things, and I've been in it for a long time working for many ministers of education. They at last got a collective group of governments to agree to a national curriculum. They got people to agree to have a national set of standards and principles around leadership. Now, you might disagree with the approach to it, and I can't go into all what that means in the time I've got available. But this meant that our voices needed to be involved in this process, especially when the national standards for teachers and principals, and I'll talk a bit more about that, have Indigenous focus areas in a number of their standards. The ACARA, the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, has some important work around the cross-curriculum perspective, and Mark mentioned this morning that he chairs an advisory group, and every time we go there, it's an argument with the curriculum designers. Sometimes it's an argument with ministers. When you hear Christopher Pine say, as I was in Melbourne one time, that there's no place for Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing in the maths and all the sciences. And then he walked in front of a car while I was crossing the road in Melbourne listening to the news about that, and got on the phone to his office and got to send him information around Indigenous knowledges in the science, and engaged him with some people that talked about our knowledges around the maths. And so the work is still needs to be done in this particular space. But the fact we're having the conversation, and the fact there is agreement of including them in these national policy agendas, but it's about execution. It is about implementation of those, and ensuring, as we've heard this morning, Indigenous-led strategies and solutions are the ones being implemented. There's a lot of work that we say needs to be done by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander educators, but in a sense, sometimes we don't get the opportunity to implement those ideas. And so the policy agenda that we set and want to work with government is a good policy setting, but the execution of those policies leaves a lot to be desired. And so I really want to thank people for their resilience and their tenaciousness for continuing to be involved in this profession and in this work. Because you're my heroes as well, because you keep at it like us. And without us having people to share and to communicate with and discuss, because this is not about individuals, this is about the collective, and our collective voices will clearly make a big difference. We know there's been national Aboriginal education policies around since the AEP in 1989, but there's in that time of the policy context, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Strategy Priority 1, Leadership and Quality Teaching, also enabled the government to invest in this particular space. And that's what we kind of worked to when we went to do this work. We believe we had around 3 major deliverables in the program. And you would think, and this is not rocket science, but there was so much work that hasn't been done over recent years, that we had to look at undertaking an audit around what has been done over the last 10 or so years that was going to inform us in the work around research. We wanted to take this as a research project, so therefore needed to gather evidence. So we did desktop audits, we ran face-to-face round tables, focus groups, As I said, we met thousands of people over the 4-year period, which included students. I said the first year, 5 year in the teaching, and those that have been principals for some time. So, as I said, we have in the work that we did, it was really unclear around how sometimes education jurisdictions were identifying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so we thought there was an undercount, and we discovered that there are certainly a couple of hundred more that were missed out from when we first started the survey to when we finally did the last survey. And I suppose there we see in terms of some of the increases, but there's lots of work to be done. We now have an instrument to collect national data. Now you would think that they would have had that all, in departments would have had that type of instrument in play as they've been collecting census data over many, many years. But around the data, there was not rich data in terms of the education workforce. The numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education workers, where they sat. So where did that 2,000 group sit? Were they primary, secondary? How many of them were leaders? How many were in executive positions within schools, and how many were principal? But we did see a growth over the life of this period of this project, where we, at the end of the day, saw 40 people get to be principals of Australian schools across jurisdictions, Catholic, independent and government. And therefore, we hope that this was a catalyst for change. It got people to think, try to identify them and put in strategies to ensure that they could retain them, attract them, retain them, and then get a pathway for them to have long-term commitments to the profession. We had really courageous conversations with the higher education sector and around their data or the lack of data that they were collecting, and their lack of plans and connectedness between schools of education and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander effort that universities were making, and I'll say a bit more about that. So in terms of the data, we now have an instrument in play that can deliver on that. Deliverable 2 was having project partnerships. So we had a reference group to this that was made up of all the different partners and players that came from ACARA, that came from from AITSL, from the National Standards Organisation. We had people from the union movement. We had people from schools jurisdictions that helped us develop and support the engagement strategy. So we spent the majority of the $7 or so million on projects, and there were 5 in the Northern Territory. And one of the things, some of the things I'd like to note here, because I'm in the Northern Territory, was the work done here by Sue Shaw in the Pathways to Teaching in remote communities at CDU, the stories that you brought to us around strong teachers in remote communities, about growing your own and in the NT, and the pathways, and teaching in the Tiwi Islands and across Arnhem Land. This was significant pieces of work. You should be congratulated, because a lot of people talk down the Northern Territory. And these types of pieces of work that you did in your schools, in this university and in your communities is a real credit to giving information to government about why they need to plan. We know what works. We just want them to fund it and to continue it. And that's what we hope we will do in the final report, which is now before government, which I will talk about soon. We had 2 sets of projects. We had tier 1s, which were national projects. They were huge investments, $800,000 to the Australian Councils of Deans of Education to get their act together, to develop action plans. You'll be surprised how many deans didn't even know they had Aboriginal units in their university. Now, we know some of the campuses are big, but the fact that none of them ever walked across a campus to go and visit the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership of the university, or didn't think it was relevant when that policy agenda is in play. But they're graduating teachers. They have to deliver on that policy agenda, teach their national curriculum, to meet certain standards, and to work collaboratively with the community. as we heard this morning, community is going to be at the heart and centre of all what we do. It's got to influence. It's got to be the driver of the work that we do. It can't be, as Mark talks about, on the riverbanks, of the river. It can't be at the fringes. It's got to be at the centre of the work that we do. And so a lot of the projects that we thought were successful about the systemic change that Dean's understood the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia. Now, you would think these are the smartest people. They're teaching teachers that teach our kids. So no wonder there's a conversation that's happening about the skills of teachers in this nation by parents and by governments. But we've engaged with that particular group in a really constructive way. And I'll talk a bit more about that. We've invested heavily in the Catholics. We spent another $500,000 to $600,000 with the Catholics, the Australian Catholic Education Commission, to drive a whole lot of work around the nation where there is strong Catholic people's participation in Catholic schools. Northern Territory was a strong content of some of that money. Western Australia, South Australia and Queensland. Some states didn't apply for any of the projects in the Catholic space, but I think the work that their colleagues did has got them interested in being involved in this debate. And so that's the systemic change that we were making in terms of influencing change. We worked with the Australian Principals Institute to build on the Dare to Lead work that we invested heavily over many, many years. And so we hope that continues in the future, and that school principals, through the money that they get directly from the Commonwealth or from the state, they're starting to embed the strategies that they know now that what works into their schools without asking for further black money. If they know these projects and programs are working, they need to just sustain them and embed them in their everyday practice. And sometimes that's hard to do. Part of this also was about building aspirations of young people to see teaching profession as a career of choice. So we spent a lot of money on a national project with Career Australia to put education up as being one of the most sexiest professions to go and aspire to working. And that work has been continuing. Locally, we funded a whole range of projects that engaged, again, directly with the community, working with teachers, first-year art teachers, working with year 7 to 12 students, trying to talk up the teaching profession, getting to understand if you want to go and apply for the university and a teacher education degree, these are types of requisites that you need and start to study for in schools. And we kind of wanted to talk it up, because you're in schools and people say, what do you want to be? I want to be a teacher. I don't want to be a teacher. No, be a teacher, be a lawyer, be a doctor. That still goes on in our schools. And so some of our own people in the profession are our own worst enemies, because we talk the profession down rather than talking it up. Hey, whatever. Three, as I said, it's about, and that's the communication strategies we had. You might have seen on the MATSITI website, I think it's one of the most proactive, interactive websites, where we put all our work on that in terms of how we're promoting and communicating strategies around a teacher education and being a good career, and in terms of a campaign. And we hope that will continue in terms of the Australian government investing in maintaining a website which they will try to support in terms of keeping it updated. In terms of outcomes of this project, universities, as I said, increased commitment by deans and heads of schools, led by the Australian Council of Deans. They had an engagement success project, so they had to develop action plans over the life of the project, and develop those and present it at annual meetings of the Council of Deans of Education, at their targeted meetings on Indigenous teacher education, because we had the highest levels of attrition in the schools of education. So the first year, we had highest levels of our students in the first year of teacher education. We wanted to, and they didn't know that. They weren't cognizant of that fact. So I was making sure that, and they were things which they had control of in terms of supporting Indigenous students studying teacher education. So this partnership, we got many of them to walk across that campus, to have partnerships with the Indigenous education units within the universities. Some did it well, others are still challenged. I think we came up with an understanding that 1/3 were okay, doing okay, 1/3 were committed, and there was 1/3 that didn't give a damn. And we could have, and before a Senate Estimates Committee, a Senate inquiry, we could have named them, because the data was their data. It was around their investment, it was around their attrition rates, it was their graduation rates. It wasn't something that the MATSITI team made up. We had the raw data that we were able to analyse and then rank them. But maybe it's not in the best interest of doing that when you're trying to build the capacity of a sector, but to show them how to do it and to improve. The deans, at least in that practice, found, in terms of Australian Indigenous lecturers in initial teacher education, there was only about 22, 23 of our people are lecturers in schools of education, and the majority of them at the level A and B level. So where were the deans growing our people and promoting them to be leaders in the undergraduate programs? Where were the course coordinators? Where were the program directors? Indeed, where were the Aboriginal deans in this space? We had one Aboriginal, I met one Aboriginal person that was a dean, and he was working at Wollongong, and he became the PVC, which is why he had to move on in Wollongong. However, the fact is, they still need to do a lot more to maintain and retain those people. The association's established, and it's a subcommittee to the Australian Council of Deans, and the work they're doing around the national standards for teachers and principals, and the work around teacher education, especially how they're going to be teaching the national standards and in the focus areas for AITSL. And we now have data around staff and student data because of this particular project, and again, that points that there needs to be a lot more work to be done. In terms of education jurisdictions, well, we know these guys, despite our kids' resilience, our parents' patience, that education jurisdictions still have a long way to go to be more culturally responsive. But we had, you wouldn't believe this, but we had to get systems to actually develop a strategy to attract and employ and maintain and promote our people in the sector. And so, you know, those 3,000 that are in the sector are doing it bloody hard, and they need us to support them and in the work that they need to do. It's very important work. As I said, we can influence the hearts and minds of young people. We need more role models. Because we say to kids that you can't be what you can't see. So if kids can't see lawyers and doctors, they can't see us as professionals, well, sometimes I won't imagine that they can get there. And so it's really important, if you've got a workforce as big as I've talked about, only having 3,000 teachers in a workforce, that's huge. We'll never close. Minister Garrett had wanted to be parity around school, the numbers of Aboriginal kids in schools. He wanted to be parity with the number of teachers in teaching in Australian schools. Well, we did some work with the University of Newcastle. It'll probably take about 3 or 4 generations to get to that level. At the same time, you know, we've got to ensure that all teachers are able to teach Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, and that's why lifting the number of Aboriginal people in higher education and teaching initial teacher education and postgraduate work, we need to lift those academic numbers to do that work, to reach out to when those teachers graduate, they at least have met Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and have a better understanding. I said we have a national analysis of the data, and still there's some jurisdictions we were closing off on this project this year would not release their 2015 data. God knows why. We have an instrument in play, and we're still negotiating with 2 jurisdictions. You can probably guess who they might be, to ensure that can still happen, because we've got the bureaucrats within Canberra that do look after data in this space, pursue those secretaries of those departments until they get the data that we need to ensure that we are seeing growth in this space. All this work will be undone. The Australian Institute of Teachers, AITSL, this is an organisation very Western, very wide. I mean, this is about educating all Australian kids, to get them to acknowledge that we're the first people of this nation, and there needs to be some focus. There needs to be those standards are good standards, but there needs to be there needs to be some focus on the work that we need to do if they're going to address the 7 standards, because they have 7 standards with 3 domains: professional knowledge, professional practice, and professional engagement. Now, there are only 2 of those standards have focus areas: know your student and how they learn, and know the content and how to teach it. And they have, so in the first one, 1.4, is a strategy for teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers. You need to know how to teach our kids so they're not marginalised in the classroom. 2.4, in terms of know the content, it is to understand and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's histories and cultures. And that's trying to embed it across the curriculum in the work that we're doing with the CARA. And I said it's bloody hard work. But we're resilient and we're tenacious and we'll keep on doing it. And that's in the spirit of promoting reconciliation. So it's not about our sovereign rights for our kids to be black. And really celebrate Indigenous knowledges from our worldview and our lens in the space. It is about ensuring that whitefellas know more about us, but where in that space is our sovereignty in terms of our knowledge systems and how our children can have space in these schools to celebrate their identity. So we've all heard how important that is. So we decided to put in it for, again, a submission to develop an online module for teacher educators who are teaching the students. Respect, relationships and reconciliation was it, and it was written by Aboriginal people, for the sector. We had a webinar about this the other day, and I was actually attending a conference, the World Indigenous Peoples Conference in higher education in New Zealand, at Aurora, and we were on a webinar, 2,000 people plus enrolled in that webinar. I was as nervous as, and the ACDE managed the process for us. So they were using their expertise to get out there. We had conversations still around that, and because people have now got the transcripts and the information and the research data that we presented in that. But the main people that wanted that were school teachers, were people in schools. That's the job of the education department. So why are they looking for something that we've developed mainly for teachers to teach in higher education? Because jurisdictions are not giving the appropriate professional development from the feedback we've got for first year out teachers looking for promotion in this space, and having to present promotion when they were going for promotion arguments about how they meet those focus areas and those particular standards. Lessons learned. Indigenous-led. Now, this I said, it's not rocket science. And as people are saying, we're still saying the same thing. Well, we're not going to apologise about that. We're going to continually emphasise it. And we're going to stick our black faces in their white faces until they get it. Because the cultural arrogance among many bureaucrats and many education jurisdictions continues to impede our process for our kids to feel great about themselves and for their parents to have faith that when they send their children to Australian schools or school down the road, they're going to be respected for who they are and come back stronger children, both in Western ways, but also have their identities reaffirmed. This project was a major catalyst for change. As I said, it got education directors having together to put together a workforce strategy in every jurisdiction. It got the universities to really have a close look at themselves and have the Australian Councils of Deans become active champions for the work that we do in spaces that we are not privileged to be in. We've got evidence now that builds on the legacies of other people's work in the past. So we've reaffirmed many of the principles and practices that have come before us, but we've given them the most recent data. And we had real project transparency. Everyone commented on the MATSITI website, and I asked you to go and have a look at that. And because it's going to be archived, and in the archive, we're trying to get the Australian Council of Deans of Education to continually maintain that and update it, and to keep it active and fresh. Because it's no good having maintaining a website if it's going to be with not having the latest data. So I've been really proud about that. The policy alignment, we brought people together from, as I said, from ACARA, from AITSL, and from jurisdictions, particularly the Aboriginal Education Advisory Group, which is not made up of all Aboriginal people, unfortunately. It's got a kind of a wrong name, but the Advisory Group to Education Ministers is, sometimes I think it's the black and white minstrel show. You know, we can't have our own Aboriginal Advisory Group. We'll have a few white fellas in to give it some credentialing. No, I respect that, as long as those non-Indigenous people understand their place in our space. And some of them, because of their experience with community or with their qualifications, think they're blacker than us. And they know more about us than we know about ourselves. So we have to challenge that. And so when we look at the wonderful young people coming through, I think we're well positioned to maintain our sovereignty in the space and to ensure that our voices are privileged. So I'm over the white privilege and the marginalisation of our voices. And as long as I'm a leader in this space, our sovereignty and coming to this work from a rights agenda rather than an equity agenda is the only way we're going to get change and traction in this space. Where to next? I was recently in Canberra. We've got the Deans, we've got Higher Education Council of Vice Chancellors to lobby the Australian Government and the Australian Education Council to respond to the MATSITI evaluation in the final report. Professor Rose was on the evaluation work. It got 10 out of 10 in terms of the work that we do, and it has a way forward. So I ask you to have a look on the website about the project and support it. This is what we're about. The kids we saw this morning, that's what we're about. And if we're not about that, we'll get out of the classroom. Get out of the education sector. But that's what we're about. We're about these kids looking happier. And I'm going to close with this one. You load it up, he's looking at me. You see, just click on it, it'll happen. Thank you, everybody.